Psalm 127, I like to call this the Christian home psalm because if you're familiar with Psalm 127, you know how it starts out. I think a lot of Christian families use this psalm a lot. I want to read all 5 verses, and then we'll get into our devotional on Psalm 127. It starts out in verse 1. Except the Lord build the house, they labor in vain that build it. Except the Lord keep the city, the watchman waketh but in vain. It is vain for you to rise up early, to sit up late, to eat the bread of sorrows, for so he giveth his beloved sleep. Lo, children are an heritage of the Lord, and the fruit of the womb is his reward. As arrows are in the hands of a mighty man, so are children of the youth. Happy is the man that hath his quiver full of them. They shall not be ashamed, but they shall speak with the enemies in the gate. I'm amazed. We started in Psalm 1 years ago, and when our churches merged in 2012, I think we were in Psalm 30-something, if my memory serves me correctly. If you keep notes, you can go back and look at that. Now we're in Psalm 127, which means we are getting close to the end, and so probably by the end of next year, we'll be done with the Psalms, and after that, I don't know what I'm going to do. I never thought that far ahead to think of what we're going to do next, but I might do just going through the Bible and just study the prayers of the Bible. I think that would be an interesting study. Anyway, I think this psalm is a psalm that every Christian parent, and especially the father, should know, and should know by heart. I think it's something that we should know by heart. It's if you don't memorize it, at least be so familiar with it that you can paraphrase it. I remember when my wife and I were first starting out as a young married couple, it was very comforting to us to know that the Lord would be the one to build our house, because at that stage in life we were young and we didn't have the ability to really do much of anything. It was comforting to know that children, because we had our children relatively quickly, to know that children were special to the Lord, and that they are his heritage and his reward. That meant something to us. It's also helpful to know that if we wanted our house to have an eternal value or eternal permanence, that the Lord would have to be the builder. He was going to be the one to do it. And if that were so, and we wanted it to be so, then that meant that our house was actually the Lord's house. So we tried to view it in that light. If you take a really good look at the psalm, there are really 5 aspects which define in the psalm whether or not your house is the Lord's house. And I'm just going to give this to you by way of introduction, and you can kind of look down at your Bibles and see what I'm referring to. But from verses 1 and 2, it's about our labor. And when our labor is in the Lord's hands, then our house is the Lord's house. And then you can look in verse 3 where we find out that our children are gifts from the Lord. And if you view that in that light, then our house is the Lord's house. Then from verse 4, when our goal is to raise our families to be effective Christians, functioning as good Christian adults, then our house is the Lord's house. And then in verse 6, when our satisfaction comes from the Lord's provision and not our own, and I guess you could also go back to verse 2 on that, then our house is the Lord's house. So if you want all of these things to be true, then you're going to have your focus on the Lord, and you're going to have to rest in him. Psalm 127 is another psalm of degrees, a song that the Jews sang while they traveled toward the city of Jerusalem. But this one was written by, I don't know if you noticed in the title, who's it written by? Solomon. You don't often think of Solomon as writing Psalms. You think of him as writing Proverbs, but surprise, he also wrote this psalm. And so it was written by Solomon. And again, I have to ask myself, why would a king who lives in Jerusalem write a psalm for travelers? Well, the reality is he probably didn't. It was probably chosen later. Psalm 127, if you read it, really has nothing to do with traveling, nothing to do with the temple, or really, for that matter, there's no real mention of Israel specifically, except in the broad principle that God had established them. Maybe Solomon's whole point was simply that the Lord needs to be the master builder of all that we do in our lives. or else we really have nothing of permanence. You think about it, there's a lot of things that great inventions have happened in the history of man. Great inventions, things that today we would find it difficult to live without. Somebody came up with the wheel. Does anybody know who? Probably not. Probably happened so far back in history. It was probably Adam when he was trying to get his carrots back to the house. He said, we got to find a way to do this easier. I don't know. But somebody invented it. But he's gone. That still exists, but nobody knows who did it. So the important thing about living in the Christian life is not to build my own name, not to make a name for myself, but to build upon the right foundation of the Lord. Jesus said something about that in Matthew chapter 7. If you remember the parable he gave in Matthew 7, verses 24 through 27, he says, therefore, whosoever heareth these sayings of mine and doeth them, I will liken him unto a wise man which built his house upon a rock. And the rain descended, and the floods came, and the winds blew and beat upon that house. And it fell not, for it was founded upon a rock. And everyone that heareth these sayings of mine and doeth them not shall be likened unto a foolish man which built his house upon the sand. And the rain descended, and the floods came, and the winds blew and beat upon that house, and it fell, and great was the fall of it. And the difference between these two men in his parable, was that one listened and one did not. One obeyed the instructions of God and one did not. So building your house upon a foundation that is a rock means we hear God's word and we obey it. Our foundation is very important. Because if the foundation is wrong, then the building stands in great danger every time the wind blows. And so we need to make sure that our house, our life, is built upon the right foundation. And Psalm 127 is great instruction. It's not that the Lord should be in our construction, though that's helpful, but that the Lord is the director of our construction. There's a big difference. In America, we have bumper stickers on cars. Koreans are starting to do more of that. But one famous bumper sticker says, God is my co-pilot. And when I read that, I think, well, you need to change seats. God doesn't help me. He directs my life. So he's the pilot. If anybody's a co-pilot, it should be me, not him. So keep that in mind. It's not enough just to have God as a part of our life. Compartmentalizing God. He's on Sundays and he's on Wednesday nights. And, we don't compartmentalize God. He is our life. He is the foundation of all that we do. One of the greatest architectural attempts of man was the Tower of Babel. The problem was it was not what God wanted. They wanted a city and a tower to rally around, in unity, but God wanted them to replenish the earth. So no matter how magnificent the project may have appeared to them or to other men, it was nothing because it didn't glorify God. So what we do must have that goal to make it God's work, to have his direction in all of it. The will of man can sometimes get out of the step of the will of God. We can not be walking in unity with God. And when that happens, God has to step in sometimes, and he has to put a stop to it. Well, that happened at the Tower of Babel, and as a result of that, now we have many languages. Now the psalm, I broke the psalm down really into 3 points. And the first point is rest in verses 1 and 2. And then reward in verses 3 and 4. And then finally rejoicing in verse 5. And each point is important, of the utmost importance, to the health of the Christian home. So I want to kind of look at it from that angle. So tonight we're just going to look at the first two verses, verses 1 and 2, where we have rest. And I want you to notice that, especially in verse 2. So it starts out, a song of degrees for Solomon. Except the Lord build the house, they labor in vain that build it. Except the Lord keep the city, the watchman waketh but in vain. It is vain for you to rise up early, to sit up late, to eat the bread of sorrows, for so he giveth his beloved sleep. Maybe you've heard this. I know I've heard this before. I've heard people say things like this. A husband goes to his wife and he says, honey, I think I need to get a second job so that we can live more comfortably. Or, honey, I think you need to go out and start working to help around the house a little bit so that we can live more comfortably. Now, I'm not saying that a second job is wrong. What I am saying is that, and I'm not saying that a wife can't help out. That's not my point at all. But what I want to point out is that far too often these discussions take place because we're trying to live in a higher realm than where we are. We're trying to build our kingdom, if you will, here. So a young couple works hard and they save up their money and they do everything that they can to be more financially successful, more financially stable, and all the while their home is neglected. And in time, it becomes a wreck, to be honest with you. Parents are always tired and usually not in the mood to talk about anything with each other, and especially not with their children. They don't have time for that because they're working all the time or they're tired. Nobody has time to really be a part of each other's lives because they're all working. And nobody sees each other because they're all working. And the children end up growing closer to their babysitters than they do their own parents. And then, when the children get older and they no longer need a babysitter, mom and dad are still working, and that's when the kids, left to themselves without a babysitter because they're old enough to live without a babysitter, do even crazier things. I thought I could tell you a story about some of the crazy things I did right here, but I won't. For the sake of time, I won't tell you about the time that I blew up our bathroom. I won't tell you things like that, okay? Why? Because there was nobody watching me. You say, well, you were 15 years old. You should have known better. I did know better, but I wasn't mature enough to do better. And mom and dad were working, and I was home alone. That's when children really go crazy. But God said that He would build the house. Why? So that we would be able to rest. We don't have to carry that burden. We don't have to try to do something that we cannot do. And believe me when I tell you this is a decision that my wife and I made when we first got married, that I would be the one to work and she would take care of the kids. And we lived that way through thick and thin, and it wasn't always easy, but we never suffered. And if you look at us now, you'll know that we definitely didn't die of starvation going through hard times. But we decided that we wanted for our home to have a spiritual focus. And the only way that I could see that we could bring that about is if we constructed our home in that way. And God blessed. If God builds it, then my house is His house. And if my house is His house, then His house ought to be my priority. You all see how that works? It's not the kind of priority that drives us to work harder, to build bigger homes, drive bigger cars, or to make more money. It's the kind of priority that makes us want to center our home with the focus being the Lord Himself. Is the spiritual welfare of your home your first priority? And some of you are sitting here saying, well, I'm single. I don't have to make that decision yet. You will. In time, it's going to happen. Make sure that the Lord is your priority. Don't let your children be raised by society. Don't let your children be destroyed by the society that raised them. Let them hear you reading the Bible. Let them see you reading the Bible. Read the Bible with them. Pray with them. Make that be the priority. Bring them to church. Don't send them to church. Bring them to church. Let them hear you witness to your neighbor. Let them see you engaged in spiritual activity around the house. Make sure your children know who really is in charge of the home. I like what Solomon had to say about the watchman. The watchman can be on the wall of the city and he can watch all day and all night, but ultimately it's going to be the Lord that keeps the city. We do our part. We do our responsibilities. But ultimately it's going to be the Lord to take care of things. As a parent, I got to tell you, I took my job as a protector of my children pretty seriously. But in time, what happens? The child grows up and they leave the nest. We guarded them. We protected them. We chose their friends for them. I know a lot of parents today say, well, you shouldn't choose your children's friends. Yeah, okay. Yeah. I know some of the kids in my neighborhood. And I got to tell you, I didn't want my children hanging out with those children. I chose their friends until they were mature enough to make their own choices. We guarded them. We protected them. But in time, they're going to go out into the world on their own. And parent, you better hope that you did your best. And you better hope you did everything you could to prepare them for that, because life is pain. It's not a friend. And it's never going to be. I don't know if you know this, but this is a wicked world. And we send our little children, our Christian kids, they grow up and they're always going to be my babies. Even when I talk to my daughter now, I call her baby. And she blushes, just like always. But they go out into the world and then they have to figure out how to take everything that they learned and apply it so that they can live a functional, prosperous Christian life. It's going to happen. And when that happens, every parent goes, Lord, I hope I did my best. They're in your hands now. Help them. Why? Because there's nothing else we can do. We can tell them. We can preach to them. We can FaceTime and yell at them when we think that they're doing wrong. But ultimately, God is going to be the one who takes care of them. So what's the point of the first few verses then? The point of the first few verses is that the Lord wants us to know that He is the one who builds. I just do my best and I leave the rest to Him. He is the one that protects. I just do my best and I leave the rest to Him. He is the one that is going to provide. I do my part as a father and as a husband, but the rest is really up to Him. And knowing that God is going to take care of it, what can I do now? I can rest. I don't have to struggle. I don't have to wring my hands. I don't have to wake up early in the morning or sit up late at night working 2 or 3 jobs trying to take care of the home, all the while neglecting things. And I got to tell you, I only worked one job the whole time. One job. But there was a period of time when I worked one job and I went to Bible college at night. And sometimes I felt like when I was at home, which was rare, my wife would look at me and she would say, what's your name again? Because we didn't see each other enough. Maybe I should have stretched 4 years into 8. Maybe that would have been better. At the time, though, I thought I got to just get through this and get it out of the way. But looking back, I can tell you that it might have been better to do it differently. So, if you can't learn from the obvious scriptures here, listen to what I'm telling you. It's important to make your home your priority as a Christian and to build that home on the Lord. When I say make the home your priority, I don't mean that, every time your kid wants a new toy, you buy it for him. A lot of kids today, they get everything that they want. They've got toys today that just amaze me. We didn't have those kinds of things. I saw a kid on TV the other day. He took a little yellow school bus, and it was a robot. We didn't have that. And it talked. We didn't have that. We had little dolls where you pull a string and it said, Mommy, or something like that. I love those because I could pull the head off and my sister would freak. That was a lot of fun. But we didn't have those kinds of things. And nowadays, they got everything. We've got kindergartners with $1,000 computers in their pockets. We didn't have that. And nowadays, the thinking is the parent has to give them everything to keep them happy. You want to keep your kids happy? Set some boundaries and teach them about the Lord. Kids respond quite well when they know what their boundaries are. But if they don't know, they'll keep pressing until they can find it. That's the way it works. And I'm not saying that because kids are bad, but they are. According to the Bible, they're foolish. Every child is foolish. The sad thing is today I'm finding that there's a lot of foolish parents. And that's causing a lot of problems. Except the Lord built a house. They labor in vain that build it. We need to keep that number one priority. Because it's vain for you to rise up early and to sit up late to eat the bread of sorrows. Why? Because if your home is built by the Lord, you can rest. He's the builder. He's the one that's the maintainer. He's the one that's going to be the provider. And then we can rest. So with that, we'll close tonight and we'll go into our time of prayer. And so let's have a word of prayer before we break up in our groups. Lord, thank you for your word. back in the old days, back in my day, we used to go up to the villages doing village evangelism. We'd ride a bus up and then walk in with our backpacks, and we'd go up there. Several of us would, take time off from our jobs or whatever, and we'd just backpack up there, and our backpacks would be filled with Bibles, ramyun. We'd have a little, pup tent to sleep in, so that we had a place to sleep at night and that sort of thing. And so you're literally walking up through the mountains, and you get tired because of the weight and stuff. And we used to sing that, Lord, lift me up to higher ground. that would help us get over the mountains. Okay, so we are in Psalm 127. Psalm 127, and Psalm 127 is, if you remember, as we were focusing on that last week, it is a psalm which gives us instruction that is often used in Christian homes. It's often applied with Christian parenting as a subject to it. And so we looked at the first two verses last week and saw how our house is supposed to be God's house. And so we pick up today in verses 3 and 4. And so I'll just read that. It says, "Lo, children are an heritage of the Lord, and the fruit of the womb is his reward. As arrows are in the hand of a mighty man, so are children of the youth." So verses 3 and 4 is the theme of reward. So if you look at these verses and you really think about what they're teaching us, the truth will impact your thinking in a lot of areas. It'll impact your thinking on abortion or homeschooling, birth control, adoption. It gives you a lot to think about in a lot of different areas because of what it tells us that children are. It defines for us what our children are and how we ought to view them. So how do you view your children? And I know that this is specifically aimed at parenting, but if you are single and someday you get married, you need to know what your kids are. Okay, so it's really for all of us. What are children? According to these verses, according to verse 3, they are a heritage of the Lord. You might possess them in your home, but they don't really belong to you. They belong to Him. You don't get to do whatever you want with them. And there's a lot of parenting that goes wrong in that way, where parents try to live out their dreams through their kids without giving much consideration to what God may want from those kids. Children are God's heritage, but also children are His reward. And to tell you the truth, this has always baffled me a bit, because even lost people, even very wicked people, have children. And so I've often wondered how that really applies to them. And I'll be honest with you, I really don't know. If you got some ideas, let me know after the service. But rather than wrestle with how this applies to others, what I've sought to do is to see how it applies to me. What does it mean to me? It means that the Lord has given me something that is to be enjoyed. It bothers me sometimes. I get confused whenever I hear Christian parents speak of their children as if their children were some kind of hindrance to them, because children are not to be a burden. It doesn't matter how many children you have. If you have one child or if you have 10 children, the Bible says the same thing. They're His reward. They're not a burden, they're a blessing. And we need to keep that in mind. And I know that when you have children, that means that money can be tighter. I understand that. I had children too. Children demand a lot of your time and effort, so you have less time to do other things that you might want to do. You may not get to go out to, I think my wife and I tried to go out to dinner once when my son was less than a year old. It didn't go well. We didn't stay long. And so things like that, you make sacrifices like that. But when all of that is happening and all of those demands are placed upon you, you need to remember that children are God's heritage. Children are God's reward. They're given to us to enjoy, not to ignore, not to avoid. There's a lot of parenting like that where, they just kind of avoid the children. Not given to somebody else to raise while you go out and try to make some more money. Not to abort, certainly, but to enjoy. So the message to parents is, enjoy your children. And take my word for it that once they've left the nest, you're going to miss them tremendously. And anyone who's ever gone through the empty nest syndrome can understand that. And I was talking to somebody about it last week. I don't remember who it was, but when my son left to go to college, we still had my daughter at home. But when she left, for the first month, my wife and I didn't know what to do with ourselves because it was so quiet around the house, and we didn't really have our own thing because, we had the family thing, but now we didn't know what to do with ourselves. But once they're gone, you're going to look back and wonder, did I do everything that I should have done in order to ensure their success? And you're going to remember times when your home was filled with their laughter and, their way of expressing themselves and the things that they did. You're going to remember all of that. You're going to remember good times, and sometimes maybe you're going to remember things that you should have done better, or maybe things you should have done differently. Well, whether you realize it or not, the whole time they're growing up, you're building memories, not just for yourself, but also for them. You're building memories, and you're setting an example at the same time. Because your kids always are going to think of you as what a parent is to be. You're the one to teach them. You're the first line of instruction for them. My kids and I, we did a lot of things together. We took trips together. We played in the park together. We went camping together. Went ice skating a couple of times. We didn't do that a whole lot because I fell down and hurt myself and I didn't want to go anymore. We went for walks in the mountains, countless games, family devotions. My son used to love to play Monopoly. My wife hated it. She thought it was a wicked game because, all the money going around and people arguing over land and stuff. And she didn't get a real kick out of that, but we did. And what were we doing? While we're doing that, all the while, we are setting an example of what the home life is to be like, what the Christian home is all about. And we built memories, good memories. But even looking back, I still wish I would have done more. I still wish I would have given more time. I still wish I would have been smart enough to make sacrifices a little bit more than what I did. So we enjoyed our kids, and they were a joy to have around. And to be honest, even to this day, my children are my best friends. When I hear about other families sometimes where the parents and the kids are at war basically over something. Just the other day I told my son, I said, I thank God that we don't have that kind of relationship. We don't. They're my best friends. But the psalmist doesn't describe them as friends. What does he call them? He describes them as arrows. And just like an archer lets the arrow fly, there comes a time when we have to let our children go too. As arrows in the hands of a mighty man, so are children of our youth. In fact, the only way that our children can actually fulfill their God-given purpose is when we let them go. The only way that an arrow is going to hit the target is if the archer lets it go. And that's a scary part of archery. That's the part once you let go that you hope you did everything right and you hope that it's going to hit the target. So when you think about that, it's implied, one of the thoughts that's implied in this section is that we as parents have been given children to prepare to hit a target. To put it in spiritual terms, to prepare them for God's use. So that's an intentional thing that we do. They don't just kind of grow up into faith. We have to guide them along the way. We have to teach them things. And that's an intentional act. It's also, by the way, a parental requirement. Deuteronomy chapter 6, verses 6 through 9 says this. And these words which I command thee this day shall be in thine heart, and thou shalt teach them diligently unto thy children. These words, God's words, they're first to be in the heart of the parent. But after that, we teach them to our children diligently. Shall talk of them when thou sittest in thine house, when thou walkest by the way, when thou liest down, when thou risest up. In other words, all the time. A big fallacy I think I see in a lot of Christian homes is the family devotion. And I think families should have that. But what they usually do is they put God in a little box, and we have family devotions, 15 minutes of God at the end of the day, and 23 hours and 45 minutes of carnality the rest of the time. And that won't work, all right? When thou sittest down, when thou risest up, when you're walking by the way, that's when you ought to be talking to your children about God. In other words, all the time, as you're going through life, in all aspects of your life. Notice verse 8. Thou shalt bind them for a sign upon thine hand, and they shall be as frontlets between thine eyes. And thou shalt write them upon the posts of thy house and on thy gates. And the idea there is that the commands of God, which are to be in my heart, ought to be the thing that is to the forefront in my family, in my home. My children ought never grow up wondering what God's word has to say about something. They should know. We should have talked about it. I should have been able to give them some guidance. A problem with a lot of parents is that they don't know their Bibles well enough. When their kids get into a certain age and they've got questions about something, parents can't really go to the Bible and answer those questions because they don't know the Bible. So if you're going to be a parent, you also need to be a theologian. It just kind of works that way. So I want you to think about an archer, because it says in verse 4, as arrows are in the hands of a mighty man, so are children of the youth. Think about an archer. An archer does not just shoot an arrow in the air and hope that that arrow hits the target. What does he do? Well, he aligns himself with the target. That's the first thing he does. In the spiritual life, that's like discerning God's purpose. God's purpose for that arrow is to hit the target. God's purpose for my children is to reach that goal that God has for them. Do you know what we don't know the future for our kids. We don't even know the future for ourselves. But you should know your child. Like we learned early on that my kids were good at doing certain things, so we wanted to develop those things because we don't know how God is going to use those things. But know your child and start developing them. What talents has God given them, and how are you helping them to develop who they are so that when they go out into life, those things are actually useful? What good is it if you are good at, for example, music? What good is it if you're good at music, but you've never learned anything about music? You're never going to play for New York's Philharmonic Orchestra if you can't read music. Doesn't matter how well you can sing. It takes training. So know them. An archer also takes a steady stance. He's not just kind of bouncing around a little bit. He takes a steady stance. We call that consistency in training. 24/7. Never letting our guard down. Keeping our eye on the goal. Focusing on spiritual things. Giving them a consistent home from where they can launch out. The archer aims the arrow. This is attention to detail and giving direction. My son, I remember when he was in college, he'll probably watch this and yell at me for it later, but when he was in college, he was going to be a wrestler. I said, no, you're not. You're not going to be a wrestler. He was going to be a wrestler. I said, no. He chose music, he chose law. I said, but wrestling, no. You're not going to be a wrestler. My thinking was, because at the age of 35, when your body's all broken up, then you got no income. My wife's thinking was, there's no way I'm going to have my son with those wrestler ears. But we were like, no. He was like, I'm 18, it's my choice. Then why are you asking me to sign the form? I'm not signing the form, okay? So we were focusing him. This is where the goal is. It's not here, it's not there. I remember a 14-year-old kid came to me one time and he said, I'm going to be a professional gamer. I said, good luck with that. Glad you're not my son. That might be fun, it might be entertaining, but very few people are actually going to get by with something like that, So know them, point them. Kids are kids. Sometimes they think they know things when they really have no clue. They really don't. Pay attention to your arrow. Make sure that it stays pointed in the right direction. And after all has been sufficiently done, then the archer finally lets the arrow fly. He lets go of it. And he has confidence at that point that it's going to hit the target. There's a story about a man who just shot arrows haphazardly, and once the arrow landed, he'd run over there and draw a circle around it and say he hit the target. And that's the way some people are about raising kids. They shoot them off haphazardly, and wherever they land, and go out and draw a circle around and say, there he is, he hit the target. He's right where he needs to be. That's God's will for him. And I don't really think that that's what the Lord has in mind for us as parents. I think he expects us to guide them. And I don't think that that ever stops. My kids are my son. How old is he? My son is 36? 84, 94, 2004, 2004. How old? 36. 35? Well, anyway, he's getting close to middle age. All right? 36. Thank you. I thought I was right. 36. And that makes my daughter 23 about 50 times. But anyway, they're grown. They got kids of their own, but I still give them advice. And they listen sometimes, and they don't listen sometimes, but I'm not done being a dad yet. And that's okay, because we have a great relationship. We built those relationships when they were younger. So they didn't shut me out at 18 and say, the law says I'm an adult now. I don't know anybody that's really mature at 18. We're not living back in the 1800s when people had mature a lot faster. We're living in a different time period. And I just don't know many people that are mature at 18. If you know of anybody, great. That's an extreme rarity. So they always need a little bit of help. I don't think God had it in mind for us to say, okay, you're 18, get out. You're on your own. Whatever you do, you do. Children are too precious to just assume that everything is going to be okay. One statistic said that nearly 60% of the children raised in a Christian home, 60%, depart from the faith once they reach adulthood. 60%. That's 6 out of 10. And if that's true, something is drastically wrong. Something is wrong. Why is that? My theory is that there are either some fallacies in their doctrinal training, maybe growing up, or maybe the home life was a bit hypocritical. Not what it was supposed to be. And I know children have their own mind. I got it. I got 2 kids. I know they do. And they'll make their own choices when they grow up. I understand that. But let's not use the free will of man as an excuse to give up on parenting. Let's claim the promises of God. Proverbs 22:6 says, train up a child in the way he should go, and when he's old, he'll not depart from it. So the question for right now, for us, is what are we doing to equip, to train our children, our arrows, to hit the right target? Nobody likes a crooked arrow. Nobody likes a broken arrow. So arrows need maintenance, and we have to maintain them. Let's move on to verse 5. Psalm 127, verse 5. It's the last verse in the psalm. Happy is the man that hath his quiver full of them. They shall not be ashamed, but they shall speak with the enemies in the gate. So the archer who has successfully and consistently hit the target is filled with joy. I know what that's like, both as a parent and also as a golfer. I hate golf. I really do. Because, they tell me it's exercise. It's not exercise. There's no exercise to golf. Maybe walking, and that's about it. But you hit that ball, and if it stays on the golf course, I'm excited. If it just stays on the golf course. But man, if that thing lands on the green, I'm so excited. Can't putt, I'm just not a very good putter. I'm always smacking that thing too hard. But you get really excited when you reach your goal. The archer whose arrow hits the target is filled with joy. And the parent whose children turn out right, they're filled with joy too. The quiver is the arrow holder. Happy is the man that hath his quiver full of them. When the quiver is full, the archer is fully armed and ready for whatever he was facing. And I've heard people say, that means that you've got to have a lot of kids. Get that quiver full. I'm not really sure that's exactly what he meant here. If you want to go that route, press on. Children are his reward. So press on with that. But I think the idea there is that the archer is armed and he is ready for whatever he will face. And children, when they're raised correctly, they will not be ashamed, but they will speak with the enemies in the gates. In other words, there will be a level of boldness to their life as a believer. A level of confidence and assurance in their beliefs. So that the gates, by the way, was a place of prominence. That's where court was held. That's where, if the city had an enemy, they would approach to the gate and they would talk about things before they were attacking or that sort of thing. So speaking with the enemies at the gate was a real good example of the child that was raised for God, because he would have that boldness that wisdom, if you will, the knowledge of what he needed to do in life and how he needed to do it. The idea is that they have learned concrete truths of right and wrong, and therefore they're fully equipped so that their lives count for something. Who wants to raise children whose lives count for nothing? Nobody does. Albert Barnes, does anybody know who Albert Barnes is? He's a commentator. And Albert Barnes is one of my favorite commentaries. If I read a commentary, I'm almost always going to go to Barnes. I like Barnes. But anyway, in his commentary on this passage, he said this: they would do honor to the family and gratify the heart of the parent by their valor in defending their city and home, or in attacking the cities of the enemies of their country. I thought, wow, he used some great words there. Honor to the family, gratifying the heart of the parent. I remember when my kids went off to college, I told them, don't forget who you are. Don't forget whose kids you are. Why? Because I want my name, the Taylor name, to mean something more than what it did in my family when I was growing up in a lost home. What good is that? Not much. I wanted to make a change, and my wife and I even talked about it. We're going to change the Taylor name. We're going to make it stand for something. And that's what we wanted. And you can't do that if you don't raise your kids for the Lord. So with that, we'll stop there. And that's the end of Psalm 127. And that means that next week, I have a special announcement. Next week, Brother Josh is going to preach. Everybody say amen?
Amen.
All right, good. So make sure you encourage him, pray for him throughout the week, because as you can see right now, he's already nervous. He's like, oh no, next week, the time has come. Brother, it's not a hanging. It's okay. All right. So with that, let's go ahead and close in prayer, and then we'll break up into groups and go to our prayer time. Lord, thank you for your word. Thank you for the psalm. It's an encouragement to us. And we talk much of prayer on Wednesday nights, but this psalm focuses very much on children and raising them for you. And we desire for our church to be that way. We don't want 60% of our kids to go out into the world. Help us to be different. Help us to make a difference.